Good day and welcome. My name is Ross Hebb, and this is a series of talks on the history of Anglicanism in the 17th century, that is, the Church in England from the years 1600 to 1700. We begin our study in the early years of that century, and Queen Elizabeth I is still on the throne. Shakespeare is still writing his plays, the last of them, and Richard Hooker has been the great defender of the Church of England as a theologian against the forces of Puritanism. But there were still issues within the Church of England, and there were deficiencies which needed to be addressed. For instance, the Church of England still lacked a necessary supply of educated and articulate clergy. Of the 10,000 clergy, not all that many were well educated or very good preachers. Also, there were continuing problems with clerical pay left over from the Reformation. Many of the clerical livings were not sufficiently financed, and so this led to two problems which were supposed to have been fixed at the time of the Reformation, namely pluralism and non-residence. That is, for a cleric to receive sufficient pay to live on, he had to be the rector of more than one parish. And of course, being the rector of more than one parish meant that he was non-resident in one of them. So these are some of the problems that persisted within the English Church. Also, the tensions which existed during Elizabeth's reign continued. On the one hand, there were still many Roman Catholics present within the kingdom. They were basically underground, and they conformed outwardly by going to church, but they were actually Roman Catholic at heart, and perhaps in some instances they actually had secret Roman Catholic priests who ministered to them at home. On the other hand, there were the Puritan-minded clergy within the Church of England. And they thought that the Church of England Reformation and the Prayer Book and the reign of Elizabeth presented an incomplete Reformation. It was one that had started but had stalled out, had run out of gas. And the Puritan element within the Church of England had a very strong underlying fear of Roman Catholics, of Roman Catholicism, and of the Pope and the papacy generally. And they thought that retaining episcopacy within the Church of England was something which needed to be purged away and was way too Roman Catholic-like. And also church government by bishops was something that they thought was a papist conspiracy and also had to be done away with for sure. Now, they too, the Puritans within the Church of England, knew that clerical education and clerical pay had to be improved. But interestingly, of the approximately 10,000 clergy within the Church of England at this time, roughly 1/3 of their livings were controlled by the lay people. And they received the tithes of wherever the income was that was supposed to be paying the clergy, and then they doled it out to clergy that they actually, in essence, hired. So in at least 1/3 of the cases, the laity of the Church of England had it within their hands to increase clerical pay, but they were rather slow to do so. Things began to change and to morph with the death of Queen Elizabeth I and the arrival of James I from Scotland. On her deathbed, Elizabeth had appointed James, actually, ironically, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, as her successor to the Kingdom of England. And James was very happy to flee south to England. It was a bigger kingdom, it was a richer kingdom, it was a much broader place in which for him to live, and he would move away from the control of the Presbyterians and the Kirk that had so much say over the goings-on in Scotland. And James, as it turns out, was brought up and a great believer in the divine right of kings. That is to say that his position as king was one that was directly the responsibility to be that position was an appointment by God, and he was in the end answerable only to God for the things he did as king. That's the notion of divine right. Now, he was, as I said, glad to flee south, and he came south, and as he did, he was actually met by a group of Puritans that presented to him on his progress south from Scotland to London, a group of Puritans, and they presented the newly arriving king with what's known to history as the Millenary Petition. And it was a petition from the Puritan-minded members within the English nation and within the Church of England, and they wanted James to continue the Reformation and to do away with things that they thought were abuses within the Church of England that required further Protestant Reformation. They objected to the use of candles in the altar. They objected to the sign of the cross at baptisms. They objected to the use of the ring in marriage as a papist and perhaps pagan superstition. And they strenuously objected to the wearing of clerical robe, the white one known as the surplice. Now, James was not adverse to the notion of hearing their complaints and their suggestions for improvement, and he called soon afterwards what's known to history as the Hampton Court Conference. And this was a conference in which, on the one side, Anglican bishops and theologians presented the case for the Church of England as it then existed, and the Puritan-minded theologians and clergy within the Church of England presented their case for continuing the Reformation and the purgation of these medieval and papist practices within the Church of England. Now, it's very important to note that in this Hampton Court Conference, the two sides did not directly debate one another. They separately presented their cases to the king. In other words, James maintained that it was his business to make the decisions as to what, if anything, was going to change. And so each side presented their cases to the king on separate occasions, on separate days even, at the Hampton Court Conference. Now, in addition to objecting to candles and rings and the sign of the cross and the surplice, the Puritan-minded within the Church of England also strenuously objected to the very concept and the practice of confirmation by bishops. They also did not like the retention of the term priest and absolution in the Book of Common Prayer. And so those are the things that they objected to. Now, they also, by way of inference, and made some reference to this, objected to church government by bishops. And they suggested something along the Presbyterian model that existed in Scotland would be a little bit better. When James heard this, he was not amused. Indeed, he was most upset, and he cried out, "No bishop, no king." That is to say that James thought that bishops were a divine appointment, and the church being governed by bishops was something which was both scriptural and of divine ordination and origin. And so he said that, if you're going to get rid of bishops, that means you're getting rid of divine authority, which probably means you'll eventually get rid of the king. And this revealed James's understanding of things, that the church, like the kingdom, was a top-down organization, and authority came not from below to those who ruled, but from above, from God, both in the state with the king and with the bishops who ruled in the church. James made his decisions as a result of the Hampton Court Conference, and the result were some slight alterations to the prayer book. There was an addition to the Catechism explaining more particularly what was meant by the sacraments, but the biggest single thing which came out of the Hampton Court Conference was James' acceptance of the notion that there needed to be a new translation of the Bible for the English nation within all the Church of England, and that resulted in 1611, the publication of what was known as the Authorized, that is, for proper usage, and only this Bible for proper usage within England, including in all the churches of England. And that translation of Scripture is known to us as the King James Version of the Scriptures. And very interestingly and importantly to note, it was done by Anglican bishops and divines, and particularly the two main universities, Cambridge and Oxford, and also it included The original King James Version included a full translation of the books of the Apocrypha as approved in the 39 Articles of Religion. So there too, the Puritans objected to the treating of the Apocrypha as anything near Scripture, and they objected to that, but they certainly did not convince King James. Now, some Puritans, as a result of these developments in the early reign of King James I, became very disgusted and concluded that there was going to be no progress in the Reformation in England, and they were so disgusted that they left the English shores and went to Holland, to Calvinistic Holland at that point in history, to join the more Protestant members of the church in Holland. In 1620, they came back to England, supplied themselves with a ship called the Mayflower, and sailed for the New World. And of course, landed in what would become Massachusetts colony in the New World. And there they were determined to form not just a new church, but a new society based upon what they considered to be biblical principles of the organization of both secular and the church. And they would form a wonderful society, a light for the nations, a house on the hill, a model Christian community in the New World. And that, of course, is the arrival of the Puritans and the Mayflower to the New World. And that story, of course, we'll pick up at a later talk. Now, all within the Church of England at this period of history was not debate and division and a struggle between the Puritan-minded and the more mainline church members within the Church of England, a struggle between those who wanted to forward the Reformation and make it, to their mind, more thoroughly biblical, and those who wanted to retain the Elizabethan settlement of religion with the Book of Common Prayer and with Episcopal church government. There were great scholars and preachers within the Church of England at this time, one of them, of course, being Lancelot Andrewes. Also, there was Jeremy Taylor. And these individuals were both great scholars in defending the position of the Church of England as it existed at that time. They were also great preachers. There was also someone who would rise to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, someone known as William Laud. And he, of course, wrote a famous book defending the Church of England against the Church of Rome. That is, that the Anglican position was purely and fully defensible against the extremes of Rome. And then, of course, there were very devout poets, including a man by the name of George Herbert, and he wrote a great deal of poetry which has come down to us, including some that's been set to music, and perhaps people will be familiar with the old blue hymn book, the hymn King of Glory, King of Peace, which is a work of George Herbert. And then finally, and very uniquely, there were very devout individuals like Nicholas Ferrer, who was interested in taking the prayer book devotional life of morning prayer and evening prayer, and the litany too, and forming a Christian community based upon that devotional life. The reading of Scripture and the use of the prayer book offices. And as opposed to in the earlier period of history where this would be often thought of as a monastic concept, this Nicholas Ferrer's vision and insight was that the Book of Common Prayer could be used, as Cranmer originally intended it, as a way to form Christian community based upon families. And Nicholas Ferrer and his wife and children and some others, a group of 20 to 30 people, left the busyness of London, went out into the English countryside to a place called Little Getting, and there they founded a Christian community based upon prayer book devotion. And one of the things the community did, of course, was they said morning and evening prayer every day, and they read their scriptures, and every night there was at least one member of the community which held vigil and prayed all night long, and every night they said the entirety of the book of Psalms, each and every night. Now, this sort of movement was something that the Puritans within the Church of England feared and hated. They thought it was a step back towards popery. They thought it was an attempt to reestablish monasticism. And they were so upset by it that even though Nicholas Ferrer died in 1637. In 1641, the Puritans wrote a book against it, calling it The Evils of the Nunnery. And then when things got really bad during the English Civil War, they actually attacked the site, burnt and destroyed everything that was there in 1646. So this shows you the extent of the passions that existed in this point in here of history, and also it shows you the extraordinary fear and paranoia about anything that could be by any stretch of the imagination associated with the earlier centuries of the Christian Church and associated with the former Roman Catholic expression of Christianity within England and the order and devotion of the earlier stages of Christian history. Now, as well as the Puritans not getting what they wanted at the Hampton Court Conference, things continued in the next couple of decades, from 1600 all the way up to 1640. And within the Church of England, there arose what's known to history as a high church party within the Church of England. Now, this is not to be confused with later in history high church associated with perhaps the Tractarians and later Anglo-Catholics. It was not that at all, but it was a movement within the Church of England who saw the Church of England and the prayer book as perfectly formed and mature expression of Christianity for the English nation, and one which they would defend and promote, on the one hand against Roman Catholics, and on the other hand against the Puritan elements within the Church of England who wanted to push the Reformation further in a more extremely Protestant direction. And their ways of defending, protecting, and promoting the Church of England was in things like encouraging greater clerical education and deeper clerical education, improving clerical pay, and they tried to do that through Parliament but were thwarted repeatedly. But they did produce some new canons or rules for the Church of England in 1604, and these were used and promoted during this time period to enforce the usage of the prayer book, and the usage of the prayer book in the way in which the prayer book was written, not to have it ordered, or have the ministers pick different scripture lessons and do hour-long sermons on things which weren't part of the scripture lessons in the prayer book. And so this group, this high church group within the Church of England, ended up having James's support, that is James I's support, and also from 1625 forward, the support of his son, Charles I, who became the new king. And in 1625, Charles came to the throne, and he was even more of a proponent and an advocate and someone who understood his position as king in the sense of the divine right of kings. He was the king, and he was the king as a result, not of politics or worldly machinations, but as a direct result of God. He was God's appointment as the king in England. And he was to rule as such over the state, over the secular government, including over Parliament, who were basically to do what he told them, and also he was to rule over the church. He was the head of the church. Just as Queen Elizabeth had made herself governor, so too Charles I greatly believed that that was his position as well. And in the church, Charles I appointed William Laud, not just as Bishop of London, but eventually in 1633 as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And William Laud, as we saw earlier, was a member of the High Church Party and a great promoter of the prayer book, and an enemy not just of the Roman Catholic detractors of the Church of England, but also of the Puritans and their Calvinistic theology. And he would, throughout his administration as the Archbishop of Canterbury, do everything in his power to restore order to the Church of England and to make sure that the settlement with the prayer book and with government of the church by bishops is something that would be continued and would be preserved and would be promoted. And it would be promoted against the Puritan objections and the Puritan attempts to undermine it or move it along in a more Protestant direction. Now, unfortunately, Archbishop William Laud was of a personality that was similar to many of the Puritans. He was not very tolerant of those who disagreed with him. And he would also truck no half measures whatsoever. He wanted a thorough application of the use of the prayer book, including its rubrics, its fine print, and also a thorough application of the canons of 1604. He insisted on clerical compliance, and if people didn't do that, he would punish them, and would use all the abilities, all the powers vested in him as archbishop, and in his bishops to enforce the use of the prayer book as printed and to enforce the use of the canons of 1604, and he would truck no criticism. And this, of course, put his attitude up against the attitude of many of the Puritans who were similarly determined and similarly persistent, and so the sparks flew down through these decades, and there was this ongoing struggle within the Church of England. Now, Archbishop Laud had at his use a church court system that had been somewhat revitalized after the year 1600, and it was a means whereby he could help to reinforce the application of his perspective and also punishment upon those who did not comply. And this inflexibility of the Archbishop, and also him being a royal appointment, tended to make even more so the case in the public mind that the Church of England's cause was intimately connected with the King's cause. And as we have seen, King James I had made that association too when he said, "No bishop, no king." Now, as it turns out, the king was having his troubles on the political side of things in England during these times as well. There was a progressive decline in the relationship between king and the English Parliament in the first 4 decades of the century. Essentially, the Parliament was not willing to be patted on the head and simply do what the king wanted it to do, as it had done in the middle period of the Elizabethan reign. Parliament wanted to assert itself, wanted to have more say, and particularly Parliament wanted to have say over two things which during the Tudor period were understood, and no opposition would be trucked on these two areas, namely foreign policy and religion. The parliaments during the first decades of this century wanted to have some say on foreign policy, what England's relationship would be to foreign powers, particularly in Europe. And particularly the Parliament, being very Protestant-minded, wanted to get along as well as possible with the small Protestant kingdoms within Europe, places like Holland and some of the German principalities, and they wanted not to get along that well with the Roman Catholic powers on the continent, especially Spain and France. And this caused a great deal of friction between the king and the Parliament. Now, in 1625, King Charles I, having come to the throne just the year before, convened a Parliament. And he needed funds because in those days, as had been the case with the Tudor period, the royal income from properties in the states was not sufficient income in order to run the country. And the role of Parliament was to pass laws and taxes to generate funds so that the king could run the country through his officers and officials more efficiently. Now, the Parliament was in no mood to grant the king, just like an obedient little subjects, all the money and the taxation that he wanted, and rather they tried to pass laws and make motions that would attack his chief advisor at the time. So Charles I disbanded Parliament. Then in 1628, he was again most desperate for money and saw no way out but to call Parliament again. This time, the Parliament wanted to have a say in foreign policy and in church affairs. Those two areas that during the Tudor period were completely understood and limited to the royal prerogative to do. And Charles wasn't having any of this. He was a divine right monarch. And so he dissolved the Parliament in 1628, 29, and then ruled for the next 11 years by royal prerogative. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means something similar to what took place in the States and does take place in the United States in these days. That is, when the president can't get what he wants through the House of Representatives or the Senate, they pass presidential orders to attempt to accomplish what they wanted to do through legislation but couldn't. And so King Charles I ruled by royal prerogative for the next 11 years. And then, sadly, things continued to deteriorate both in church and state, and in 1637 there was an attempt to impose an Anglican prayer book on the Scottish part of the realm, which was almost entirely Presbyterian. And this attempt to impose a Anglican prayer book on the church as it existed in Scotland did not go over well. Indeed, it went so unwell that the Scottish raised an army and started to march south on England. And then in 1640, the king had to, in response to raise funds to defend the realm, call Parliament again because the nation was being invaded. But Parliament at this time would have none of this on the king's terms. And so they turned on his chief advisor, had him arrested and thrown in the tower. Also, they found their opportunity, because they had the cards in their hands, to attack Archbishop Laud. He too was accused of treason. He was arrested and thrown into the Tower of London. Charles, in desperation, physically entered himself into Parliament to try to arrest members of Parliament, their leaders. This failed, and then he left London out for Oxford, and there, of course, in a few years' time, would raise the royal standard, and things had deteriorated at such a point that civil war erupted in the land of England. The king and the royalist forces on the one hand, and the Parliament and initially the Presbyterians, and in league with the Scottish invasion force on the other hand. The king's advisors, both in state and church, his chief advisor and handler of Parliament was executed. A few years later, also Archbishop Laud, his enemies got their way, and he too was executed. And civil war erupted in 1642, and the English nation would go without royal rule for basically 20 years, and things would not return to some semblance of normalcy in a historical sense, with king and parliament ruling the nation together until 1660 and 1661. But that, of course, is a story for our next session. Thank you very much, and good day.